Hey, Pathway students!
I'm Emma.
I'm Aaliyah. We are a part of the Pathway Students Leadership Team, and we are excited to have you joining us for online service today.
Before we get started with today's message, we have a few announcements for you guys.
If you want to grow as a person and have a ton of fun, you should get involved in Student Leadership Team here at Pathways. Go ahead and send us an email or DM us on social media. We'd love to have you.
And while we're on that subject, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit us up on our social media down below. This week, we'll be diving into week 3 of our current series, Stand Your Ground with Pastor Chad, where we will learn about the historical events of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection.
So grab these pens and journals and watch this.
Welcome back, team. So last week we talked about the evidence for the fine-tuning of the universe. It was powerful to see how fine-tuned our universe is and how finely tuned we are as people. This is a powerful argument for a personal and loving God. And in week 1, we saw the evidence that a being outside of time, space, and matter brought the whole universe into existence. Tonight, we will discover the ways in which this creator God has revealed himself. There have been many men who claim to be prophets or teachers of a certain God. Siddhartha Gautama was the founder of Buddhism. Muhammad was the prophet of Allah. And there are many more. All of these people can be found in graves, and they never claimed to be God. But, check this out, there is another man. There's a man who claimed to be God, and his tomb is empty. This man's name is Jesus. Jesus' life, death, burial, and resurrection sent a shockwave through time. It is now a known fact across the scientific world that Jesus was in fact a real person who died and rose again. So today, we're gonna look at the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus and the evidence for the historical accuracy of the New Testament. Let's start with Jesus' resurrection. I'm stoked. So think about this. If Jesus didn't rise from the dead, then he was just another guy, just another dude, which would mean that Christianity would be pointless. So it's not just Jesus' life and death that are important. His resurrection is even more important because it proves that Jesus really is who he said he was. As Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15:17, if Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile. So it is so important to know for sure that Jesus really did rise from the dead. And obviously, there are people who say he did not, even though a straightforward reading of the gospel and the New Testament would lead us to believe that he did. So the people who deny that Jesus' resurrection happened have to make up theories about how it could have only seemed like Jesus rose from the dead. Let's look at some of those theories now. The first of these theories is the conspiracy theory. This claims that either Jesus' disciples, the Jewish leaders, or the Romans stole Jesus' body and hid it to make it seem like Jesus had risen from the dead. That's crazy. This is not a very believable suggestion at all, you guys, because neither the Romans or the Jewish leaders would have wanted it to seem like Jesus rose from the dead. In fact, they killed him and then put a big rock and some guards in front of his tomb to prevent exactly that. It is also not at all convincing to suggest that the disciples stole Jesus' body for 2 main reasons. 10 out of the 12 disciples ended up being tortured and killed for their faith in Jesus' death and resurrection. There is simply no way that all 10 of these men would die for something they knew they made up in the first place. No way I'm getting my head chopped off for a practical joke, you guys. But there's also another really good reason why the disciples would not have made up Jesus' resurrection. All right, check this out. Jesus' disciples were expecting Jesus to free the Israelites, God's people, from the Roman Empire. When Jesus died, they thought it was all over. They thought it was all over, you guys. In fact, the Bible even tells us that the disciples didn't believe that Jesus had risen when their friends told them they had seen him alive. That's crazy, right? The disciples' poor response not only shows that they did not make up a story about Jesus rising from the dead, but it also reflects the accuracy and honesty of the disciples who tell about their lack of faith in the Gospels that they would later write about. So for these reasons, no scholars believe that this way of explaining the resurrection of Jesus holds any weight, you guys. The next theory is the apparent death theory. This says that Jesus didn't really die. He was just mostly dead and then healed up after he was placed in the tomb. What? After that, people who accept this idea say Jesus escaped and somehow managed to convince everyone he rose from the dead. Here are our replies to this claim. First off, the Roman executioners were professional killers. They were very, very careful not to make mistakes because if they failed, you guys, they would have been killed themselves. Think about that. And here's the thing, you guys. Even if Jesus had somehow been laid in the tomb, not quite dead, he would have died in the sealed tomb shortly after from the torture he went through. Y'all, he was ripped to the bone 39 times with a whip that had pieces of metal and bone in it. He carried a 180-pound beam over 1,800 feet to the place he would be nailed to the cross. Next, he hung there suffocating for hours and hours before finally being stabbed in the side with a spear. You guys, there is no way Jesus didn't really die. But even if we say he was only mostly dead, someone who went through all of that would have bled out and suffocated in the airtight tomb that they laid him in. So this theory fails. Let's look at the next one called the displaced body theory. This is the claim that a man named Joseph of Arimathea placed Jesus' body in the tomb because it was a convenient place to drop him at the time. That seems far-fetched. All right, check this out. Later, he moved Jesus' body to a mass criminal graveyard so that when the disciples visited the first tomb, they thought Jesus had risen from the dead. Here's what we would say to this first theory. First of all, it was against Jewish law to move a body after it was placed in a tomb. Joseph was a faithful Jew and would not have broken this law just because it was convenient, you guys, okay? Second, if the disciples had begun telling people about the resurrection, Joseph would have just corrected them, you guys. He could have easily brought the body out or just said, nah, guys, put it over here instead. Third, we know that the criminal graveyard was very close to where the crucifixions took place. So, it would have been more convenient for Joseph to just place the body directly in the criminal graveyard. So once again, this theory fails. So let's look at a fourth and final main theory called the hallucination theory. This is the claim that the disciples didn't really see Jesus resurrected, but only thought they saw him because they had a hallucination. People who believe in this theory say it went a little something like this.
Jesus!
You guys, this is just crazy and shows how hard people have tried to avoid believing that Jesus did rise from the dead. Jesus did not appear just one time, but many times. Jesus appeared to groups of people and not just to individuals, okay? Jesus appeared to believers and unbelievers. To argue that all of these different appearances of Jesus were just hallucinations shared by every single person involved is completely crazy. So now that we have shown these theories that have been invented to explain away the resurrection of Jesus simply don't make a lot of sense. Think about this, you guys, okay? No written sources from the first century disagree with the gospel reports of the resurrection. In fact, ancient historians like Tacitus and Josephus, they give testimonies matching the gospel records even though they weren't even Christians themselves. These ancient accounts from historians that line up with the Bible's story of Jesus' death and resurrection add a huge amount of credibility to what we read in the Bible. So, let's look at two of these examples now. Tacitus was a Roman historian who lived right after Jesus' life, and he probably met people who had even seen Jesus. Here's what he wrote. Nero inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. This account from a Roman historian lines up perfectly with what the Bible tells us about Jesus' death and his resurrection. So, Josephus, he was a Jewish man who lived from 37 AD to 97 AD, and he wrote about Jesus in his famous history book, Antiquities of the Jews. He wrote, there was a wise man named Jesus. His conduct was good, and he was virtuous. And many people from among the Jews and other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die, but those who became his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion, and that he was alive. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah, concerning whom the prophets have recounted wonders. So, Josephus' history also matches what we learn about Jesus' death and resurrection in the Gospels, you guys. Now here's the really, really crazy thing, you guys. Now, we have more ancient historical writings about Jesus' life, death, and resurrection than we have for the lives of other big shots in the ancient world. For instance, Tiberius was the Roman emperor during the time of Jesus, and being the Roman emperor in the time of Jesus was basically the same as being the king of the world. Tiberius is mentioned in Luke 3:1, and Tiberius reigned for 23 years. You would think there would be tons of sources over the next 50 years talking about Tiberius' life, and it would be a good guess to assume that we would have more writings about Tiberius' life than we do about Jesus' life. Check this out. That guess would be wrong. There are actually way more references to the life of Jesus than to the life of Tiberius. Tiberius had 9 references compared to Jesus' 10 references, not including the Bible. If we add in the Christian sources, the score will be 43-10. Jesus wins! What this shows is that if we doubt that Jesus was a historical person, we have to doubt whether or not almost everyone from ancient history was a real person, because there is way more evidence for Jesus being real than most other ancient people. Pretty cool, right? We have also seen that Romans and Jewish historians working independently of one another also talk about the events we find in the Bible, confirming the New Testament's historical accuracy. If all of these reports were not based on real accounts, we would not have a consistent record of these events, you guys. N.T. Wright, a New Testament scholar, writes, "I cannot explain the rise of early Christianity unless Jesus rose again. All of Christianity is rooted in Jesus defeating death in our place, and it's the only explanation for how a few followers of a man named Jesus exploded to become the official faith of the Roman Empire just 300 years later. I submit to you right now that Jesus rose from the grave and defeated sin and death. He did all of that in our place. It was supposed to be us on the cross. Romans 6:23 says, the penalty of sin is death. Jesus knew he would need to take our place because we are imperfect creatures, y'all, and he is the perfect creator. Now, before we're done tonight, let's look at why we can trust the rest of the New Testament as well. I'm gonna give you a couple of numbers that will blow your mind. Y'all, we have over 5,800 copies of the Greek New Testament. The second most historically reliable document in the ancient world is Homer's Iliad, okay? You might end up reading this in college. It only has 643 copies. In other words, we have 5,157 more copies of the New Testament than we have of any other ancient piece of writing in existence. Now, to help you guys get an idea of how crazy this is, here is a 2-scale representation of how many copies of the New Testament we have versus your average classical writing from the ancient world. Check this out. And you want me to let it fall? Yeah, go for it. Okay. Crazy, right? Now, if that doesn't blow your mind, we have copies of the New Testament that were copied only 50 years from the originals. What? The earliest copy we have of the Iliad is 400 years after the original was written. This is unbelievable evidence that shows us that we really can trust the Bible, because the more copies we have and the earlier they were written, the more we know that what we have is accurate. We can look at these numbers and see God protecting his word written for his people, you and me. Long story short, you guys, we have an accurately preserved New Testament. But you might be asking, what about all the errors in the Bible I've heard people talk about? Let me help you out. There are 400,000 differences in the Greek copies we have of the New Testament. This is a lot. What does this mean for the Christian, though? Should we be worried about these differences? Not at all, you guys. Not even a little bit. We only have so many differences because we have so many copies. Like we said, there are over 5,800 Greek copies of the New Testament, which comes to about 2.6 million pages. That's insane. That means that there is only one difference every 6.5 pages. 75% of these differences are just spelling errors made by copiers. 15% are variations in Greek synonyms, and 9% are late changes made by copiers, but we can catch these changes because we have so many earlier copies. Less than 1% of all 400,000 of these differences affect what a verse actually means, you guys, and none of these differences actually challenge or affect what we believe as Christians. Yes. Y'all, we have shown incredible evidence that the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus are real historical events, and we have seen some incredible numbers that show us that the New Testament containing these stories about Jesus is mind-blowingly trustworthy. I have no doubt that what we have today is what was written back then. Thanks for joining us tonight. Stay stoked.
What a cool message. What did you think?
I thought it was great. I'm still amazed that there is so much evidence from Jesus rising from the dead and that the New Testament is a reliable source of truth.
Right? It's so cool though. We can historically prove that Jesus rose from the dead.
And hey, before we go, think about who you can share these videos with. Do you know someone who doesn't believe in God? Someone who's wrestling with what they believe? Share these videos with them. And next week, make sure to invite your friends too to watch with you. Go ahead and click on your small group links and we'll see you next week, Wednesday at 6:30.
Peace out.
Bye!